Pena mana ina reo e rorangatirama, no mai haramai, tēnā koutou katoa, ko waita nei te tū ake nei, ko Helen Nicholson toko ingoa, te pōkoko mataraka te wharewananga o Otago. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Kia ora, my name's Helen Nicholson and I'm the Deputy Vice-Chancellor Academic, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to this very special occasion to celebrate Ian Barber's promotion to Professor. These lectures are a great opportunity for all of us to take time out to listen to our amazing staff and gain an understanding of the research excellence across our university. I'd like to welcome our colleagues, students and friends from across the university and the wider community, those of you who are in the room and those online. But I'd like to give a very special welcome to Matapura Ellison, Kati Hurapa Runaka ki Puketuraki representative, the Deputy Kai Whakahari, Nicola Taylor, Chairperson of Purakanui Block Incorporated, and Sarah Gallagher, Acting Area Manager, Kai Whakarahari, Topua Takiwa, Heritage New Zealand. Promotion to Professor at Otago is not easily achieved, and Ian has had to demonstrate sustained excellence in teaching, research and service. Ian is an archaeologist and anthropologist who researches human societies and explores how they have adapted to changing physical and social environments. Ian studies and teaches change in the past as well as the past in the present, from a critical position that acknowledges multiple and especially Indigenous voices. His academic projects consider Maori economic settlement and material culture change, Indigenous agronomy, culture contact in Polynesia, and the anthropology of race. Congratulations, Ian. We're very fortunate to have you as part of our university whānau. I'd now like to invite Professor Tim Thomas, Head of Programme of Archaeology, to provide a formal introduction to Professor Barber. Nō reira, tēnā koutou katoa.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Ko Tim Thomas, toku ingoa. Ki te mana whenua e mihi ana. Ki te rangatira o te wharewananga o Otago e mihi ana anō. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. My name's Tim Thomas and I'm the head of the archaeology program, and it's my pleasure and privilege today to introduce my colleague Professor Ian Barber to you all. Ian is a long-standing member of our university community. He studied for his BA at Otago in 1981 before transferring to Auckland and completing a master's thesis, and then returning to Otago for his PhD, which was awarded in 1996. Ian then worked in Wellington as a senior archaeologist at the Historic Places Trust, a role responsible for administering the management of all of New Zealand's archaeological heritage. And I think I met Ian in 1999, the year he was appointed as a lecturer at Otago, and I was just starting my PhD at the time. Back then, my hair was a lot longer, and I think Ian's was shorter, and he was the only archaeologist I'd ever met wearing a suit. So he looked every bit the Wellington professional when he arrived in Otago. And this was something that he brought to Otago, to our program, a new focus on archaeology as a professional practice, and he developed courses that had a strong heritage management content. This area gradually became a central part of the curriculum due to increasing job opportunities for graduates in the heritage sector, and Otago is fortunate to have Ian's expertise and experience. He's known by students, past and present, as an enthusiastic, even ebullient lecturer with a sometimes absurdist sense of humour and a gift for delivering precise and socially relevant course content. Ian teaches a critical anthropological approach to the past, not just the contemporary practice of archaeology, but also questions about why and how communities value heritage and its politics. These themes have guided his research interests in the archaeology of Aotearoa, but also in the historical anthropology of Mormonism in America and the Pacific, which has seen him awarded a Fulbright scholarship at Brigham Young University and visiting positions at Princeton and the University of Utah. Ian's heritage expertise also underlies his service as a board member of the New Zealand Archaeological Association, the Historic Cemeteries Conservation Trust, and his regular advice on heritage management to local and national governing bodies. And a noteworthy example of the latter is his submissions to Parliament in support of the Moriori Claims Settlement Bill in 2021, now an act, which stem from his projects and partnerships on the Chatham Islands. A major focus of Ian's work is, of course, the archaeology of Māori society. Ian is renowned as a meticulous scholar in this area, often collaborating with specialist scientists. This work can seem quite particularistic, studying agricultural practices via soil science, or examining radiocarbon dates with Bayesian statistics. And when he excavated an archaeological site at Purakanui, which everybody else thought was a fishing camp, and found kumara storage pits, he confirmed it using microscopic starch grain analysis. I see he's brought a more practical demonstration today, or confirmation or proof today. But despite those particularistic aspects, Ian's writing never loses sight of the bigger picture. A recurring theme in his work is the question of how humans manage their resources more broadly. This goes back to his PhD when he examined the role of resource scarcity in Aotearoa after the extinction of moa and other fauna. Where previous archaeologists had approached this from an ecological perspective as an almost inevitable consequence of human activity, Ian was and remains interested in the cultural responses to loss, how Māori society developed customary principles of resource management and environmental regulation, often with ritual and religious components. That is, instead of assuming self-interest leading to complete resource exhaustion, Ian described evidence of cooperative practices that encourage sustainability. And the relevance of this perspective to our contemporary concerns is hopefully obvious. Ian's research epitomizes the idea that we do not go into the past to only study it, but to learn from it and plan for our futures. It's a vision of an anthropologically informed archaeology that engages in public discourse. And this is, of course, reflected in the title of his lecture today, Archaeology and the Mataranga Science Debate. And I think we all look forward to hearing your archaeological perspective on this debate. Ian? So, no reira, uru mai, ki te mihi mai, ki Ian Barber. Join me in welcoming Ian to the podium for his inaugural professorial lecture.
Kia hora te marino. Aroha atu, aroha mai tātou I a tātou katoa. Huia, tai ki ea. Nā mihi nui, kia koutou katoa. Thank you, Helen and Tim, for your very kind and generous words. And thank you everyone for coming to this inaugural professorial lecture. Now, anyone who knows me well will probably recognise or concede that I'm not someone who is all that comfortable with talking about myself. I'm very happy to discuss my research. I'm delighted to talk about the things that I have studied and that seem important and relevant. I'm less comfortable when it comes to personal history and disclosing things about me. And having said that, I'm aware that in IPLs it is expected that one does make certain acknowledgements that relate to one's own personal history, and there are some that I need to make here just very quickly. Firstly, I want to thank and acknowledge my partner Fiona, who's here today, who just is extraordinary in terms of her support and involvement with much of the mahi that I do. Going back to my youth, I'd like to acknowledge na iwi or Ngāti Koata me Ngāti Kuia, and in particular the Hippolyte and Elkington whānau, who generously incorporated me within their whānau identity and activities as a young person growing up in Nelson through various associations. And in particular I'm mindful of and want to acknowledge important kaumātua and kuia of Ngāti Koata, Ngāti Kuia, Uncle Rangi Elkington, Auntie Lucy Elkington, Kaiapa Kohe, Uncle Jack, Uncle John Hippolyte, all of whom were important influences from the whānau and larger hapu. In further work that I have undertaken, I guess with that background as motivation, I have continued to work closely with the iwi communities. I want to acknowledge in particular locally Kati Huirapa ki te Puki te Raki, who have been enormously supportive of my interests in local archaeology and a case study of interest to Kati Huirapa, and within the Kati Huirapa rohe will be an important part of today's talk. Nicola Taylor of the Pūrākau Nui Block Incorporation. That incorporation owns the land on which the principal site that I'm going to talk about today is situated, and I'm very grateful to Nikki for the support that she has given me. And I would be remiss not to mention Moriori. Since 2010 I've had the privilege of a relationship with Hokutehe Moriori Trust, the legal representative of Moriori on Reakohu, the Chatham Islands. That relationship is professional and archaeological, but it has also become very personal and developed, where I've developed deep friendships that are now very meaningful to me. And in particular, I want to acknowledge Maui Solomon, Susan Thorpe, and Tom Lanose, among others. Okay, so we'll now move into the talk. I have realised as I have been preparing this talk that I set myself quite a substantial topic. It seemed like seemed like a good idea at the time, but as I've continued working on it, I've realised that there's all sorts of things one needs to be mindful of, and there's been a lot involved with getting this to where I hope it's of some consequence. Actually, I'm sorry, I'm just going to recall, I cannot believe I did this, but joining us also from the far north are representatives of Te Rarawa, and in particular I'd like to acknowledge Waikarere Gregory of Nahapu o Pukipoto o Te Rarawa. This iwi and area will be one of my case studies, and just in acknowledgement also of that iwi, I'd like to recognise Ross Gregory, Waikarere's dad, who regrettably passed away in 2018, and who was a very important influence on me early in my career and in my mahi in that area. So I'd like to acknowledge Ross's memory and the interest and involvement of Te Rarawa and support for the mahi that I've undertaken in the far north. Okay, so now let's return to the address, archaeology and the Mātauranga science debate. And before moving on, I better just notice something fairly obvious, which one or two people have commented on. The image, again, the spade seemed like a good idea at the time, but I am conscious since that, with a slightly manic look, that's the kind of image that could potentially scare small children. but anyway, be that as it may, there we have it. The spade obviously representing archaeology as one side of a relationship. Okay, so in July 2021, a New Zealand Ministry of Education technical report proposed that the school curriculum should provide parity between the teaching of Mātauranga Māori and other bodies of knowledge. This followed growing Māori educator demands to decolonise education and recognise science values within traditional knowledge, within Mātauranga. A group of 7 Auckland professors wrote to the university, a group of 7 University of Auckland professors wrote to the Listener magazine, the letter under the heading In Defence of Science, published later in 2021, and they basically disagreed with this proposal. They characterised it as a proposal that represented, in effect, a rejection of scientific values and suggested that it would undermine education generally, but also and more specifically for Māori. And this point was reiterated by one of the letter writers, Garth Cooper, who is Māori, Ngāti Mahanga, in fact a renowned health care delivery and science educator, Māori health care delivery and science educator, who after some debate continued from the original letter, and that included an investigation by the Royal Society of Garth Cooper and one of the other letter writers. Garth Cooper resigned from the Royal Society and said, real bias stems from the view that Māori can't do things or participate fully in society because they're Māori. Unfortunately, the partial substitution of Mātauranga Māori for international format science education, perhaps unintendedly, is implying that. Now, more than 2,000 academics on the other side signed a response to this letter written by Auckland COVID researchers Sean Hendy and Sushi Wiles, who you will all know of course. This letter characterised their colleagues' views as ignoring the fact that colonisation, racism, misogyny and eugenics have each been championed by scientists wielding a self-declared monopoly on universal knowledge. They categorically rejected the letter writer's assumptions and their core assumption that traditional knowledge should not be taught alongside or in the science class at all. The Royal Society of New Zealand, which, as I've just mentioned, also investigated Garth Cooper, responded to reject the letter's narrow and outmoded definition of science. And, as I say, having just got a little ahead of my bullet points here, initiated an investigation of 2 of the letter writers, one of which was Garth Cooper. I think it's fair to say no matter which side of the debate one falls on, and I'm not going to dissect it in great detail, but I think it's one of those fault on both sides kind of things, and I'm not sure that anyone came out of it looking terribly good. From afar, Richard Dawkins, UK evolutionary biologist, controversial advocate for science over religion, and more recently, very strong proponent of controversial views on gender and sexuality, wrote to the Royal Society of New Zealand decrying the, quote, ludicrous move to incorporate Māori ways of knowing into science curricula in New Zealand. Dawkins was pretty adamant. No Indigenous myths from anywhere in the world, no matter how poetic or hauntingly beautiful, belong in science classes. Science classes are emphatically not the right place to teach scientific falsehoods alongside true science. Now, in terms of that debate, I've made my own contribution, and here it is in 2021, which was recognised by national, including Māori press, and to a certain extent internationally. And this reflects the fact, this was a few months before the letter writers, and this reflects the fact that discussions about science and mātauranga were going on in our society for quite some time, certainly from the beginning of the 21st century, if not before. So what I'm going to do today is not just to respond to the 2021 letter writers, although I guess that's my primary focus in the first instance, but to look at the larger issue and to assess what in effect, if you'll excuse the philosophical terminology, the epistemological question of the scientific value and nature of mātauranga, and doing so from the perspective of archaeology, the anthropological science of the material human past. Now, the science theme I'm going to touch on, and Tim alluded to it in his remarks, concerns agricultural science, specifically the adaptation of tropical Polynesian crops to their southern limits of productivity here in temperate climate Aotearoa me te Waipounamu, a remarkable agronomy of the pre-modern world. Now, as those of you who have been taught by me will recall, whenever I set an essay question or comment on essay questions, I always tell students to make sure that they define their terminology. So I need to walk the talk myself here. So let's firstly define science from the Oxford Reference website, fairly respectable place, suggesting that science encompasses the systematic study of the structure and behaviour of the physical and natural world through observation and experiment. Mātauranga is defined briefly by the online and authoritative Māori dictionary as knowledge, wisdom, understanding, skill, traditional knowledge, wisdom, understanding, skill, sometimes used in the plural. University of Auckland geologist Daniel Hikuroa of Ngāti Maniapoto, who is, as well as being a scientist, someone who is very, very interested from his own cultural perspective in investigating science and mātauranga, defines mātauranga Māori as the pursuit and application of knowledge and understanding of te taiao, the natural world, following a systematic methodology, including codified knowledge and a suite of techniques empirical in nature for investigating phenomena, acquiring new knowledge, and updating and integrating previous knowledge. Now, I will just observe in passing that that's not necessarily a definition of mātauranga that certainly my kaumātua who taught me in the 20th century would necessarily have gone to or even been necessarily comfortable with. I think it's fair to say that what Daniel Hikuroa has done here is to define and perhaps even redefine mātauranga so that it is seen to be a dynamic body of knowledge that grows and develops in ways that may seem to be or approach science, and that perhaps can be seen if I just flick back to our definition of science from Oxford, the systematic study of the structure and behaviour of the physical and natural world through observation. I think it's fair to say that Daniel Hikuroa is providing a new perspective, a new insight, if you like, on what mātauranga may be considered or could be considered. So I'm talking about agronomy in Aotearoa, both archaeology and the mātauranga or mātauraka of agronomy. The background here is that the first Polynesian settlers of Aotearoa me te Waipounamu, of our archipelago, brought 6 tropical crops from the Central Pacific. Now, these crops included 2 trees, they included gourd or hui, and 3 root crops, and it's those root crops that will be of my primary focus today. They include, firstly, the semi-aquatic taro, Colocasia esculenta, which has edible corms and an edible leaf, and it often grows in wetlands, such as shown here in the upper right of this slide in Rarotonga. There is dry Asia-Pacific yam, or ufi, Dioscorea species. The genus and species grown here was almost certainly Dioscorea alata, which is grown for edible tubers. And finally, but by no means least, there is the hardy, although wet-sensitive, American sweet potato, Kumara Ipomoea batatas, which has edible tuberous roots. The leaves are occasionally eaten too sometimes, and it's grown in mounds. Interestingly, of those crops, 2 are American, Ipomoea batatas, of course, as I've just indicated, and hui, and that has led to considerable speculation over many years about possible contact between Polynesia and the Americas. It's a fascinating area, but one that unfortunately we don't have any time to visit at all tonight, but I'll simply just acknowledge it in passing that that's kind of an interesting area itself, and that one of the most important and staple crops of Māori was American rather than Asia-Pacific taro or ufi, which were grown but had a much more restricted range and were more difficult to produce in Aotearoa, where basically agriculture involved seasonal production, and this stimulated the development of underground storage pits, ruakumara, for roots that were kept for both consumption and also as seed crop to be planted out in the following year. Field evidence of adaptive kumara cultivation in temperate Aotearoa includes earth and stone lines and mounds for borders, wind shelters, perhaps planting beds. Soils were also modified extensively, as in this profile from the Waimea Plains in Nelson, by sand and gravel additions that improved both drainage and thermal qualities. All of these techniques, or many of these techniques, were devoted to and targeted towards improving the warmth of the soil for these tropical crops. Now, while this evidence of kumara cultivation is fairly widespread and in many cases not difficult to identify, evidence of taro in Aotearoa has been much more difficult to find or agree on. And that's where we're going to turn now. This is my northern example, obviously. In 1922, surveyor D.M. Wilson published on what he called old drains that had become visible on rich alluvial soils of the so-called Kaitaia swamp in the far north at the base of the Opuri Peninsula, extending from Lake Tangonge, which you can see there in the map, to Awanui River. These old drains were most noticeable in that portion south of Lake Tangonge, Wilson wrote. He mapped a section of the old drains at Pukepoto, where they had been recognised in land development 40 years earlier by a farming family who, Wilson noted, had no knowledge of their existence before starting drainage operations. And the editor of the Journal of the Polynesian Society, in which Wilson published his article, surmised that these old drains were cut for the cultivation of taro in a moist soil. If you'll recall, as I indicated, taro is a semi-aquatic and grows in damp or wet soils, needs to grow in relatively damp or wet soils, and is well suited to proper wet cultivation as well, growing in pond fields. Just as well to note the significance of this archaeology, in 1921 Wilson also described a very interesting carving which had been discovered during these draining operations, reportedly hidden in a canal submerged between the level of the Kaitaia swamp for a very considerable period. And this is the now famous Kaitaia carving that many of you will be well aware of, sometimes referred to as Tangonge itself, after the name of the lake. It is a highly significant taonga of Te Rarawa, and it may well preserve an early carving style. And I think it's quite cool to note here, given that we're talking about these wetland drains, that it was found in one of these drains. Now, through the 20th century, draining operations continued in the Kaitaia region, and aerial photographs revealed further ditch remains of ancient engineered wetland fields that had been constructed on a large scale, covering tens of hectares, unfortunately mostly destroyed now in pastoralism. Now, my own fieldwork in the far north has certainly, I've visited these places and localities, tried to find out as much as I can about them, but in terms of excavation field work, primarily I've been working to the north of Kaitaia on the Aupuri Peninsula, on the northwestern margins of Motutangi Swamp, which until the last couple of decades was the largest intact area of wetland ditches, but also is now largely destroyed in 21st century agriculture. I will just note in passing, whether I should or not, but I will say that this experience with these ditches and watching their destruction has been one of the great disappointments of my professional career. I've worked with historic places and have tried to advocate for the protection and preservation of these places. Unfortunately, they've continued to be destroyed, and in the most recent iteration basically have been this last fairly intact area has been destroyed in the interests of avocado production. The Heritage in New Zealand Pohere Taonga Act, such as it is, protects all archaeological sites, but that protection is in effect, because it is blanket protection, only works by becoming in effect regulated destruction. It's actually very hard to actually protect or preserve anything old, anything heritage in Aotearoa, unfortunately. And in the case, as I say, of Motutangi, I've watched basically as these systems have basically been destroyed for guacamole, which has been, as I say, rather hard to deal with. These photographs taken, probably 15 years ago now, as I began working in Motutangi, and you can see, we'll use this pointer, that you can see the ditch systems here, which are capturing water and aquifers and springs at the base of these dunes behind 90 Mile Beach, so that that water reticulates out over lowland slopes. And here's what the ditches look like in excavation. They carried water across those gentle slopes from main ditches into reticulate networks. And this is not Motutangi, this is Rarotonga, but this is field work in 2010 where I basically went in search of what I was digging up at Motutangi to try and find what I might have been dealing with in terms of contemporary practices, and these are raised bed fields for taro in Rarotonga, and I think this is the kind of thing that we're looking at in Motutangi. Radiocarbon evidence, admittedly from relatively undifferentiated ditch fill, suggests that one of the critical networks functioned between the 16th to 17th century CE. More and better dates are needed, and in fact I've actually I'm now working on some material, some short life material that will provide that chronology, I'm pleased to say, or at least a better improved chronology. But even with those earlier dates, you can see that we're dealing with pre-modern systems. Tim mentioned microbotanical remains. I began working in the early 2000s with a botanist from the University of Auckland, who's now working independently, Mark Horrocks, and Mark identified starch granules, reserve starch granules, which are characteristic of seeds as well as underground storage organs, excavated from sediments extracted from excavated sediments from one of the primary archaeological sites to see if we could identify the cultigens that had been grown in those soils. Since then, my MA student Rebecca Benham has done further work, and these slides here, A and B, come from Rebecca's very fine work and a recently submitted MA thesis. These enclosed masses of small granules, each less than 4 microns. That 20 shouldn't be there, that should just say less than 4 microns. So they're really, really small, characteristic of taro. And in the lower part of the slide A, you can see a taro reference granule. As well as taro, we found evidence of uwhi, which was very exciting, Dioscorea alata, yam, which we believe have been or had been grown in higher, drier areas between the ditches, because yam is not a wetland crop. You can see the distinctive starch granules, both from my work with Mark on the left, and then Rebecca's work confirming the starch granules on the right. Yam granules are very large, they're elongate, they have an eccentric centre or hilum, and are quite distinctive. So there really isn't any doubt that these are Dioscorea. But interestingly, we also found sweet potato, which we didn't, or at least Ipomoea, I should say more accurately, the genus Ipomoea, which, however, given that the only other native Ipomoea in the area grows on the coast and not inland, is most likely to be Ipomoea batatas. And these these archaeological examples A to E show a distinctive centre with a fissure that is characteristic of many granules of sweet potato, between 7 and 30 to 40 microns long. They're also faceted. F and G show reference examples. Now, let's return to Pukepoto and talk about Mātauranga. So, I've given a somewhat emotional tribute and recognition to Ross Gregory, and Waikarere is joining us. Kia ora e hoa. And this whakatauki, which Ross shared with me many years ago, Waikarere and others have published since in 2016, is in the first instance an indication of the encoding of the history of taro in this traditional form. So in this whakatauki, ano o ne ngā mara taro o a Tai Awarua, behold the taro gardens of Tai Awarua, ka pupuhi te hau ka tāngonge noa, when the wind blows the leaves undulate and ripple. Now, bear in mind that in the 19th century, Europeans were not aware of the fact that there had been taro fields in the Tangonge area. That was something that Europeans, non-Māori, started to appreciate with drainage operations. But among hapu, among whānau of Te Rarawa, there were and are important Mātauranga, important traditions, important whakatauki, such as the Tai Awarua whakatauki, that recall and remember taro in the land and in the landscape. The photograph I've shown you obviously is not from Tangonge, it's irrigated taro in Rarotonga, but it may kind of illustrate perhaps the effect of the taro leaves that may undulate and ripple. For anyone interested in te reo, let me just note in passing as well that word tangonge, which is a northern word for undulation or ripple, is not a word you're going to find in the Māori dictionary. Waikarere tells me that it is a local word probably to the locality, and is an example of a number of words that, a number of kupu that one encounters in and across the motu that represent regional differentiation. So I just want to acknowledge that in terms of that whakatauki. So these ditches, as I say, were not functioning or not known generally at the time of 19th century settlement, which raises the question, what happened to them? Well, according to Wilson, one old Māori told Mr. Stuart Masters, who'd first drained the land, that the drains were of Māori origin. The natives had numerous eel weirs across them. This is obviously 1920s European scholar language. And a big flood came down from the hills and the weirs blocked up the drains holding the wash. They were never cleared, and so the system fell into decay. Now this is mediated through two different sources, from Mr. Stuart Masters through to Wilson. So I'm not suggesting that we have here a pristine account, but what we do have at least is an account that seems to suggest that flooding may have had something to do with the demise of these systems. And this tradition imbricates another body of law involving very important northern tipuna, including Kauri and Rua Kerepeti, as well as the iwi Ngāti who were said to be resident in the far north in many accounts. And the version I'm going to select to illustrate the Kauri Rua Kerepeti account comes from Wilson because he collected it from hapu at Pukepoto, but there are a number of other accounts, some of which vary in some details. According to Wilson, about 8 generations ago, Kaitaia chief Rua Kurapete lived at Kaitaia with his hapu, and a chief called Kauri lived at Pukepoto. These two quarrelled. Rua Kurapete dug a drain from the Kaitaia River to a fair-sized stream that runs into Lake Tangonge. The Kaitaia River becomes large in times of flood and diverts into the lake, which spreads its banks at Pukepoto. And in this account, this event flooded Kauri and his hapu out, destroying their plantations. Kauri then conceived the idea of digging a drain from the Kaitaia swamp to the sea, but that was unsuccessful, and thereafter left Pukepoto. Now, at this point in time, let's bring in some contemporary environmental science, and in particular, the work of Andrew Laurie and other climate scientists who have been looking at what they call the so-called Little Ice Age, which is a global climate phenomenon that in the Northern Hemisphere has been identified to about 1350, 1400. Its advent in the south is still a subject of some debate, but Laurie and others have suggested that we do see evidence of climate cooling down here in the south, coincident with the Little Ice Age. And note, the interval post-1500 CE to the onset of the 20th century was typified by more frequent cold and wet conditions that is coarsely characterised as the counterpart to the Little Ice Age. The conditions were likely influenced by more frequent trough and zonal synoptic weather regimes. Now, my suggestion is that this Little Ice Age, and in fact increased rainfall, may potentially be relevant to these references, these traditional mātauranga and historical references to lowland flooding and subsequent relocation. They may well reflect an increased rainfall of the later LIA. And I think one only has to look at the events of earlier this year in terms of the rain in both the Bay of Plenty and in this very region in the far north to see what rain can do as a result of climate change in the destruction of crops. So these are not just matters of historical climate interpretation alone. They relate potentially to long-term climate modelling, and that might well be critical to understand modern climate change. Now, my second case study, as I've indicated, is local. Down here in Te Waiponamu by 1600 CE, the East Coast North Island iwi Ngāti Māmoe, or in the southern variation Kāti Māmoe, had migrated to Te Waiponamu to settle among resident Waitaha people, and subsequently Ngāi Tahu, southern variant Kaitahu, migrated from the same region to settle most of Te Waiponamu. In the archaeology of early settlement in the south, murihiku, a term which I'm using following a traditional usage, which is to consider the larger region of the far south, including Otago and the area known as Southland, as murihiku. We see settlements based around large, self-sufficient but short-lived coastal papakaika. This is the so-called transient village model, argued by some of our colleagues, Anderson and Smith. And these villages are situated, as you might expect, at river mouths and estuaries, rich places where lots of food is available, lots of marine and other foods are available. With the loss of moa and diminishment of seal colonies over time, shellfish and finfish became more important economically, however. Also to acknowledge, in terms of terrestrial resources, te kauka, the New Zealand cabbage tree, Cordyline australis, was encouraged on forest margins and clearings. It was possibly planted. Its sweet stems and rhizomes were steamed and consumed for fructose, and they could also be stored. Now, the question of crops in the south or not is a really intriguing one. The orthodoxy, the archaeological orthodoxy, certainly the orthodoxy that I was trained on, if you like, is that it was not possible to either store, to store let alone grow crops south of Taumutu, just south of Banks Peninsula. Hardy non-live kumara known as kau, which shown here on the right of the slide. This is kau that I've prepared myself, dried myself, was exchanged and that's acknowledged in a number of accounts, but live kumara roots, according to the orthodoxy, were not stored or grown further south of Banks Peninsula. Now, in the early part of this century, which makes me sound really old, I had the great pleasure of working with my colleague Richard Walter, running a field school at Purakonui Inlet with the support of, as I say, Kati Huirapa and the Purakonui Block Incorporation as we excavated an eroding midden site. Now, this site had been excavated previously and interpreted as a specialist fishing and shell fishing settlement. And indeed, the midden was dominated by fish, maka, hoka, local shellfish, and moa and seal elements were relatively sparse, which was consistent with the 15th century chronology revealed in our radiocarbon work. There's an in situ oven at the base of the midden that we excavated. Now, as well as midden, which we expected to find, we also found pits or rua between in situ midden layers, which I have continued working on and have interpreted as storage facilities. And the earliest of these are dated very, very securely and tightly on short life material, excavated below and in the fill of the pit to around the mid-15th century. In a Bayesian model, Tim mentioned Bayesian modelling, I won't derail the presentation by talking about radiocarbon modelling and Bayesian stats, although Richard Barker is here, perhaps I should. No, actually Richard Barker is here, I shouldn't. But suffice to note that that we have a very secure chronology for these pits between 1430 and 1460 CE. Now, what's really cool is that, and it took quite a bit of time for me to convince myself of this because it just seems so extraordinary, that the dimensions and rectangular form of these covered pits, and we know they're covered because, as you can see from the archaeological plan here, there are post holes around the sides, follow the exact template of seasonal Māori rua kumara. Now, this interpretation was strengthened by the recovery of archaeological starch granules. These were identified at first by my colleague Mark Horrocks, and then in the course of a Marsden investigation, Monica Tromp, who I think is here, did some very fine work as well to continue to look at these sediments and to find indeed starch granules that, as at Motutangi, certainly look very much like Ipomoea, the genus Ipomoea. And you don't get a native Ipomoea down here, so if you're accepting that these granules are Ipomoea, then that can only be Ipomoea batatas, kumara, or sweet potato. So finding pits in the exact form of rua kumara, finding starch granules that closely resembled the starch granules of Ipomoea, I suggest is a provides a pretty compelling argument for what is basically Polynesia's southernmost rua kumara, the southernmost storage of live kumara, and they have to be live kumara rather than kau. You wouldn't dig pits. You don't need to dig pits for kau. You dig pits to basically preserve and keep your live kumara roots. Actually, at this point in time, I should probably introduce my little friend here, who I've brought since I brought this kumara plant along. I think I was going to talk about that plant a little earlier on when I mentioned archaeological orthodoxies. Against the orthodoxy that kumara doesn't grow down here, that's a kumara plant. So please don't tell him that he's not supposed to be growing here. Growing very successfully in my place at Opoho, a very sunny locality. Just to illustrate the point, really. Now, we proposed, my colleague Tom Hyam, who undertook some pretty flash Bayesian statistical analysis for our paper that we published in 2021, that the introduction of this technology to Purakanui in the earlier 15th century from a warmer Aotearoa region may have been stimulated by local socio-economic impacts of megafaunal loss, which is basically a flash way, or a rather complex way of saying that once the moa and seal were gone, people were looking for other ways to basically get their food. Now, we argued further that this archaeological evidence can be related to important southern mātauraka, that's the southern form of mātauranga, around kumera, and the E there is deliberate, that's the southern form of kumara, kumera is the southern form, in Murihiku. Multiple Katimamoe whakapapa identify an ancestor, a tipuna by the name of Rongo, or in the southern dialect, Roko Itua, and he is associated with a widespread narrative of kumara origins. So in the north he's Rongo Itua, and in other forms in the south he's Roko Itua. In the southern form, and actually in many of the northern accounts, Rongo from Hawaii visits the original people of Aotearoa, who are Kahui or Toi people, and those people offer him local plant foods. He declines, and instead he rehydrates his dried kumara or kau from Hawaii, offers it to the Aotearoa people, who are so impressed they send waka back to source live Hawaii kumara. Now, in the northern traditions, these waka that go back to Hawaii return very generously provisioned with kumara, which they plant out at several locations. But in the southern accounts, in Ngaitahu or Kaitahu accounts, the crop establishment was unimpressive, if not unsuccessful. For example, in one Murihiku version, the returning waka manuka failed to produce, the kumara from that waka failed to produce, rotting in the ground because, according to the account, the required karakia was neglected. And in a further very widespread southern account specific to Ngaitahu, the waka Arai Te Uru returned to lose its kumara cargo overboard, and taro and hui in some accounts, in stormy seas off Moiraki, North Otago, before wrecking on the coast of its now, the coast which now takes its traditional name. So in tradition, the Otago coastline is Arai Te Uru. In 1844, local Māori identified those lost kumara from Araiteuru to Walter Mantell as globular North Otago beach boulders. Now, here one might identify, superficially, a clash between science and mātauranga, because in geology, these boulders are spherical, septarian concretions within a Paleocene mudstone, take a deep breath, exposed by wave erosion. The Māori account, obviously, is very different. But if that account is seen to reference cultural and environmental history rather than a geology, then the spilled crops, I suggest, inform uniquely, if in a novel symbolic way, on early southern attempts to establish kumara against a climatic and botanical science reality that this is very challenging in the far south. Now, other traditions in the south also suggest that the challenge was overcome in some warm localities at least, specifically Pa Atewera, which of course is such an important place to Kati Huirapa, and I acknowledge that, and their mana over that place, in the Huriawa, on the Huriawa Peninsula at the Waikawaiti River mouth, named for the Ariki, Te Wera, but also the place of an earlier Kati Mamoe Pa site. A Ngaitahu account recorded by John White describes a siege at this ancient pa where a kumara atua was kept, rongo or roku nui a tau. And as that siege took place, those who were attacking the pa, one of them managed to get access to the pa and stole roku nui a tau. And to honour his missing atua, the tohunga of the pa, according to White's account, cleared a small space to resemble a cultivation on which mounds were made like those for a ritual kumara garden. And after this, Roku returned. Now there's a really another intriguing association, I didn't make this association in my paper, this is new, between the Orokonui Valley, which is situated very close to Purakanui, and of course you local folk will know the Orokonui Nature Reserve. Orokonui is the southern form of Orongonui, which describes the 28th night of the month in the Māori calendar, and as Elsden best observed, this was a specially favoured one for planting the kumara. Doubtless the name represents, best thought, kumara atua rongo marae roa of far-spread Polynesian fame. Just another one of a number of connections between kupu, places, accounts, and kumara. Now, a later and more famous siege recorded at Pa Te Wera involving Te Wera himself by his relative Taoka in the 18th century also has an account of an atua, kahukura, stolen during the siege, that also returns in response to karakia, just like Roku Nui a Tau. And interestingly, kahukura is associated traditionally with Rongonui a Tau and also with kumara as source from Hawaii, as one who brought the kumara from Hawaii, and he's also considered a kumara atua. In some northern accounts, kahukura is a rainbow deity and crosses the rainbow, bringing kumara with him to Aotearoa. In a 1930s Ngaitahu account recorded by Carrington, the journalist Carrington, Ngaitahu authorities told Carrington that Te Wera's pa was stocked with, quote, fern root, kumara and potted bird and fish against Te Auka's siege. Another independent account by Cowan in 1906, drawing on local Māori sources, also identified the memory of cultivations below Pa Te Wera. Interestingly though, these kōrero tuku iho, these stories of old from Huriawa, are the only late Murihiku kumara traditions of record. So what happened to the rua kumara of Purakanui, and why are kōrero tuku iho for later southern kumara restricted to a single warm North Otago locality? Here I want to suggest again, or ask the question at least, whether these southern kōrero and mātaraka may also track impacts of cooler temperatures incident to the global Little Ice Age. Potentially or possibly, the Little Ice Age may have precipitated production and supply failures from wherever newly vulnerable 15th to 16th century southern horticultural margins may have been. The other question to ask is whether adverse LIA weather events impacted bulk kumara root transfer to Murihiku by waka, and whether the Arai Te Uru kumara upset may well recall some of those, or may recall such an event. Now, whatever the answers to those questions, and I don't pretend to have them, nor am I pretending I should absolutely say here, in fact I should have said it before, but I'm not in any way suggesting that I'm an expert in these mātauraka. The mana authority of these mātauraka belong to iwi, not to me, to hapu whānau. And I'm simply exploring connections with their consent and support, just simply to continue a conversation and to seek to enrich our local archaeology. So whatever the answers to those questions, having established, I hope, that I'm not pretending to be the authority on this, the reality is that the archaeological discovery of rua at Purakanui is without question associated with a coastline, Arai Te Uru, and with Kaitahu, Katimamoi, and Waitaha accounts that I haven't really had time to go into, and kupu, words that recall ancient kumara loss as well as more limited presence. And these mātauraka and archaeological science are complementary, I would suggest, and together enrich the past. The hui of these knowledge sets points to the novel rāranga of environmental history into the fabric of mātauranga. And that rāranga underscores an argument that mātauranga encodes invaluable experiential knowledge that should inform modern scientific understanding and education in Aotearoa. And it also highlights the potential for Indigenous knowledge to contribute to urgent climate change and sustainability studies, a potential underscored by the reality that it is extractive Western ideologies, technologies and science that have now brought the world to the brink of global catastrophe. Thank you.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Jessica Palmer toko inga ko te manakura o Te Kita Aranui a te wharewana o tākou tēnei. I have the great pleasure as the PVC of the Division of Humanities to present a vote of thanks to Ian. And in doing so, I have to confess I'm a mere law professor, so rather out of my depth. And secondly, that I wanted to make a couple of observations that I think stand back from what he's saying, but commend him for what he's doing. And so the first one, I guess, springboards off the fact that I stand here as a representative of the Division of Humanities when we've heard a fascinating IPL entitled Archaeology and the Mātauranga Science Debate. And what does that say about where we stick archaeology in the university? Does it belong in the sciences, or is it in fact at home in the humanities? And I think Ian's address to us shows beautifully why it is both and why the question is an irrelevant one. And that what he does is to take scientific methods and scientific thought to show us how they reveal the way that humans interact with the world around them in the past, now, and potentially in the future. How we understand our world, and in so doing shed light on our ancestors and what they knew and thought and what their lifestyles were like. So thank you. Thank you, Ian, for doing that. And thank you that you have shown us that the questions around where we locate our beings of knowledge is irrelevant, and what's far more important is the questions around why and how our research matter. And I think you demonstrated tonight why your research matters. And the second observation I want to make, and it flows from that first one, I suppose, is that I think Ian's research and his life work, in a sense, demonstrates the life-giving and reconciliating role that I think an academic can have between te ao Māori and te ao Pākehā, between Mātauranga Māori and Mātauranga Pākehā, and at a time in this nation where that connection and that relationship and interaction is so sorely needed. The answer to debates about knowledge and validity is simply to get on and do the mahi. And that's what you've done, Ian. So I want to thank you for that. I want to recognise that that's been years in the making, and much of that takes time to invest in relationships and to learn about a culture that isn't necessarily your own, to embrace whakawhanaungatanga and real humility. And you've done that in spades. That was not intended. So Ian, I want to say thank you to you for doing that, and thank you for giving us a glimpse tonight into what that hard mahi can do for us as a nation, and the benefit of that work can do for us. I also want to use this vote of thanks as a little bit of a platform, and a platform that I think Ian would appreciate. And that is that when I was preparing for this vote of thanks, I also had earlier in the day come across my inbox a recent piece in E Tangata, which is a summarised version of a more extended version, and it's a piece by Tara McAllister called 50 Reasons There Are No Māori in Your Science Department. And I thought, and I know Ian will appreciate this because it's effectively the part two, or the response to the listener 5 gang. And she lists a whole bunch of reasons why we struggle in this relationship between Māori and Pākehā in science. And they're very good reasons, and it's sobering reading, and it's something that we, as citizens of an institution like this, need to spend time reflecting on and thinking about. But it struck me as I read them that Ian is one of those treasured people in this university who is stepping out on that journey and trying to do it well and with integrity. And there were 3 reasons in particular that I want to read out from Tara, and I think she has absolutely a point, but I want to use it in the reverse here and say, here are 3 reasons that Ian has in his work tried so hard to push against and to give voice to Te Ao Māori. So here they are. Reasons why there are no Māori in your science department. Number 3, toru, because your department is full of dusty dinosaurs who don't believe our tipuna knew science. I think Ian showed us that he absolutely does believe that our Māori tipuna knew science fully well. Because we don't want to help you superficially gain access to Māori communities and knowledge when your intentions are ambiguous at best. Do you know whose stolen land you are standing on? Have you read decolonising methodologies? Do you understand the stories of our people? Ian, thank you. Thank you for taking the time to understand the stories of Māori and to give voice to them. And the third one, it's number 9 in her list. Because our whakapapa and bodies will not be used superficially to tick your vision Mātauranga box, only to have our ideas and bodies swiftly discarded and disregarded when the cash money comes in. And Ian's research has gained significant grant monies, and congratulations for that. And yet, that's not why he does it. And it is about what Tara is asking for, that we won't superficially use the whakapapa and bodies of our Māori colleagues and friends and family, but that we will listen to them and that we will learn to understand what they tell us about science and knowledge. So bravo, Ian. The university is making progress on this. Some would say slowly, and I understand that and appreciate that. And I thank you, Ian, that you've stepped out and been someone who's believed in that important part of what academia could do your whole career. So bravo to you. I think it's really important, in addition to commending Ian for that, to commend those Māori communities that have agreed to partner with Ian. And so I want to thank those of you who are here from Kāti Huirapa and from, I don't think we've got anyone from Te Raroa in person with us, but certainly hopefully online. And I think Maui is joining us online from Rekohu, representing Moriori. Thank you so much. As someone on behalf of the university leadership, I want to say thank you. Thank you for your patience with us. Thank you for partnering with Ian. And thank you for continuing to believe that research and academic research can make a difference. So thank you to those communities. Nō reira, whakamihi ki a koe, ahorangi Ian Barber, ka mihi nui ki a koe mō tā mahi, me mō tā whai kōrero tēnei pō. Ka mutu pea. I have the great pleasure now to pass over this wee gift, which is a small memento for this occasion.
Thank you.
And more importantly for your achievement. So congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for your...
And finally, to all of you who are here with us in person, kanohi te ki te kanohi, thank you so much for coming. And those of you who are online, thank you very much for watching, whether it's now or later. Haere mai, ihua. For those of you who are here, please come with us to have some food and some hospitality and some whakawhanaungatanga. We are moving over from here to the staff club. We're in the ground floor this time round. And can I please encourage you to come? I know it's another 2 or 3 minutes walk, but it's worth it because there's food and friendly faces there. So thank you all very much. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, me pō Mārie.